Imagine a princess, born into unimaginable wealth and power, a persistent force of tragedy. Her life, a curse veiled in velvet. Why has history nearly erased her? Welcome back to Words of Time. Today, we're revealing the shocking story of Europe's forgotten royal. Princess Charlotte of Prussia remains one of the most overlooked and tragic figures in European royal history. While most princesses are remembered for their beauty, marriages, or influence in political alliances, Charlotte's story is one that history has largely chosen to forget. She lived a life that was far removed from the fairy tales people often imagine when they think of royalty. Her world was filled with personal sorrow, illness, and family discord. Her life could be described as a long series of misfortunes, and many who knew of her story believed she carried a curse that followed her from birth to death. Charlotte was born into one of Europe's most powerful royal families, the Prussian House of Hohenzollern. Her father, Prince Albert of Prussia, was a man of stern discipline and emotional distance, and her mother, Princess Marianne of the Netherlands, was known for her independent spirit and defiance of royal convention. Their marriage was troubled almost from the start, filled with quarrels and disloyalties. When Charlotte was still a small child, her parents separated in scandal, an event that deeply affected her. In a royal world that prized appearances and obedience, her mother's refusal to conform to expected behavior marked Charlotte from an early age. Her parents' separation led to a complicated childhood, with Charlotte caught between two worlds: the rigid formality of her father's household and the unconventional freedom her mother sought after being cast out of royal society. As a young girl, Charlotte was described as sensitive and intelligent, but her emotional world was fragile. Those close to her often noted her nervous temperament and her tendency to retreat into herself. The constant tension between her parents and the whispered gossip that surrounded her family left her insecure and lonely. While other royal children grew up surrounded by tutors, balls, and admiration, Charlotte's life was defined by instability. The shadow of her mother's disgrace followed her wherever she went. Her father, determined to distance himself and his children from scandal, ensured Charlotte was raised under strict supervision. He demanded obedience and emotional control, believing that discipline would shape her into a proper princess. But Charlotte's spirit was not easily contained. She longed for affection and understanding, yet found little of either in her surroundings. Her letters, written later in life, reveal a woman who struggled deeply with feelings of isolation and melancholy. As Charlotte reached her teenage years, her health began to decline. She suffered from frequent headaches, fainting spells, and bouts of depression that would worsen over time. In an era when mental health was poorly understood, her symptoms were often dismissed as nervousness or hysteria. Doctors prescribed rest, tonics, and travel, but nothing seemed to help for long. Despite her fragile health, she was expected to fulfill her duty by marrying well, as all princesses were required to do. Her marriage prospects were a matter of political interest rather than personal choice. Eventually, she was married to George, the hereditary prince of Saxe-Meiningen. At first, her marriage seemed to offer her a chance for stability, but the reality proved very different. George was a man of serious temperament, devoted to military life and duty. He had little patience for Charlotte's emotional struggles or her need for comfort. The union was strained almost from the beginning. They were two very different people forced together by political expectation rather than love. Their early years together were filled with tension. Charlotte's health continued to decline, and she often found herself confined to her rooms, plagued by pain and exhaustion. Her husband, though not cruel, was distant and often frustrated by her frailty. Her inability to perform the traditional duties of a royal wife, attending functions, managing household affairs, and bearing children, created further strain between them. Charlotte gave birth to a daughter, also named Charlotte, but motherhood brought her little joy. Her illnesses grew worse after childbirth, and she became more withdrawn from public life. The small court of Saxe-Meiningen was known for its strict social codes, and Charlotte's erratic behavior soon became the subject of gossip. Her unpredictable moods, emotional outbursts, and long periods of seclusion led many to whisper that she was unstable. The combination of physical pain and emotional despair began to erode her mind. Those around her described her as a woman trapped in endless suffering, both body and soul. Charlotte's relationship with her husband deteriorated further. George, despite moments of compassion, grew increasingly cold toward her. He was known to spend long periods away, absorbed in his military duties or court obligations, leaving Charlotte isolated. Her loneliness became unbearable. She sought comfort in writing letters, often pouring out her pain in words that reveal a woman desperate for understanding. In one of her writings, she spoke of feeling like a shadow in her own life, unseen and unheard, trapped within walls of duty and sorrow. Her mental condition worsened as years went by. Physicians, unsure of how to treat her, resorted to methods that only deepened her distress. Treatments such as isolation, cold baths, and sedatives were common at the time. What she truly needed, compassion, care, and understanding, was in short supply. Her reputation began to suffer, and she was increasingly seen as a problem rather than a person. Eventually, Charlotte's mental illness became so severe that she was confined to an institution. The decision was made quietly, as the royal family wished to avoid public scandal. She was placed under medical supervision, cut off from society, and even from her family. Reports from those who saw her during this period describe a woman who had lost touch with reality, alternately calm and agitated, sometimes lucid but often lost in confusion. Her years in confinement were marked by deep sadness. The few letters that survive from that time reveal her awareness of her condition and her longing for freedom. She wrote of being surrounded by silence, of hearing whispers in the halls that she could not escape. Her words painted a haunting picture of a woman abandoned by everyone she loved. Even her daughter was kept away from her, raised instead under the care of relatives. In her final years, Charlotte became a forgotten figure. Once a princess of Prussia, she was now a silent presence in a remote institution, her story hidden away. She died young, her life consumed by illness and loneliness. There was no grand farewell, no celebration of her memory. Her death barely made a ripple in the public eye, overshadowed by the more glamorous lives of her royal relatives. What makes Charlotte's story so haunting is not just the tragedy of her life, but the silence that followed it. History tends to celebrate the triumphs of royalty, not their suffering. Charlotte's name faded from public memory, buried beneath layers of more convenient narratives. Yet her life reveals much about the pressures faced by royal women in the 19th century. They were expected to embody perfection, beauty, obedience, grace, while having little control over their own lives. For someone as sensitive and introspective as Charlotte, the rigid confines of royal duty became unbearable. The image of a cursed princess may seem dramatic, but in Charlotte's case, it feels almost fitting. Misfortune followed her at every stage of her life. From the scandal of her parents' marriage to her own unhappy union, from her failing health to her tragic end, she seemed destined for sorrow. Her story reminds us that royalty is no protection against suffering. Beneath the jewels and titles, she was a human being, vulnerable and fragile, struggling to find meaning in a world that offered her little kindness. The contrast between how Charlotte's life began and how it ended is stark. Born into privilege, she should have enjoyed a life of comfort and respect. Instead, she became a symbol of how power and prestige can mask deep unhappiness. Her story also reflects how mental illness was misunderstood and mishandled in her time. Women like her were often silenced rather than helped, hidden away to preserve the dignity of the crown. Charlotte's case sheds light on a broader pattern within royal families across Europe during that period. Many members suffered from hereditary illnesses, both physical and psychological, due to generations of intermarriage. There was little understanding of genetics or mental health, and conditions that might be treatable today were often left to worsen unchecked. For someone like Charlotte, whose emotional sensitivity was already pronounced, the pressures of her lineage likely intensified her suffering. Her life also exposes the emotional cost of being born into royalty. While the outside world envied royal lives, the reality was far from glamorous. Every decision, every word, and every gesture was subject to scrutiny. There was no room for personal weakness. Charlotte's attempts to express her feelings were seen as signs of instability rather than cries for help. The culture of silence and decorum that surrounded her only deepened her isolation. One cannot help but imagine how different her life might have been had she been born in another time. In a world with greater understanding of mental health, she might have received compassion and proper treatment instead of confinement. In a society less obsessed with appearances, her sensitivity might have been seen as a gift rather than a flaw. But history rarely offers such mercy. After her death, Charlotte's daughter grew up largely under the care of others, distanced from the memory of her mother. The few surviving accounts of Charlotte's life come from letters, diary fragments, and reports written by those who served her. These documents, though limited, paint a portrait of a woman of depth and feeling, capable of tenderness and reflection despite her pain. They reveal her as someone who yearned for connection, who saw beauty even in despair. Over time, historians have begun to revisit her story, trying to piece together the truth behind the legend of the cursed princess. While much remains uncertain, what is clear is that Charlotte's suffering was real, and her humanity deserves acknowledgement. She was not a fairy tale figure or a cautionary tale, but a woman whose life reflects the darker side of royal existence. Her story invites us to question how many others like her have been forgotten. Royal history is filled with bright names and celebrated reigns, but beneath that surface lie countless hidden lives, overshadowed by silence. Charlotte's life, though tragic, gives voice to those who were silenced by convention and fear. Her pain, though centuries old, speaks to universal human experiences, longing, loss, and the search for understanding. In remembering Charlotte, we are also reminded of the fragility of those placed upon pedestals. The title of princess offered her no shield against despair. Her lineage, which should have been her pride, became the source of her burden. In many ways, Charlotte's life reflects the contradiction at the heart of monarchy itself: immense power coupled with deep personal powerlessness. Her story continues to resonate because it exposes truths that are timeless. Every society, no matter how advanced, tends to hide its uncomfortable realities. In her time, madness and sorrow were things to be concealed, not confronted. Charlotte's fate was a product of that silence. Today, as we look back, her life becomes a mirror through which we can see how far understanding and compassion have come, and how far they still need to go. Though her name remains obscure in most history books, those who uncover her story find a haunting narrative of a woman who lived and died behind palace walls, unseen and unheard. The whispers of her life linger still, not as tales of glamour or scandal, but as a reminder of the hidden cost of royalty. Her crown was never a symbol of power or happiness, but a weight she carried until it crushed her spirit. Princess Charlotte of Prussia stands as a symbol of forgotten sorrow, a figure who defied the romantic image of royalty. Her life, marked by tragedy, reflects the pain that can lie beneath the surface of privilege. To speak of her today is to give voice to a woman who was silenced by her circumstances. Her whispers, long ignored, tell a story not of grandeur, but of endurance. She remains a reminder that even in the grandest of palaces, loneliness can echo louder than music, and the crown can be more a curse than a blessing. The story of Princess Charlotte of Prussia begins in a time of great political tension and family turmoil, a setting that would shape her fate before she ever drew her first breath. Her birth came not into a peaceful and harmonious royal household, but into one fractured by resentment, scandal, and emotional distance. The very circumstances surrounding her arrival into the world seemed to cast a shadow over her life from the very start. Even as a newborn, she was burdened by forces far beyond her control, and the court whispers that followed her birth hinted at the idea that she was destined for sorrow. Her father, Prince Albert of Prussia, belonged to one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe, the House of Hohenzollern, which was known for its discipline, pride, and strict moral code. The Prussian court was a place of rigid formality, where emotion was seen as weakness and personal happiness was often sacrificed for duty. Her mother, Princess Marianne of the Netherlands, was quite the opposite. She was warm, passionate, and rebellious, unwilling to accept the cold conventions that governed royal life. The marriage between Albert and Marianne had been arranged as a political alliance, a common practice of the time, but from the very beginning it was a union destined for trouble. Their temperaments clashed violently. Albert demanded obedience and restraint, while Marianne longed for affection and freedom. When Charlotte was born, the royal household was already crumbling under the weight of discord. Rumors of her mother's defiance and her father's anger had spread throughout Europe's royal circles. The tension between them was no secret, and their inability to find peace poisoned the atmosphere in which their children were raised. From the day she was born, Charlotte's life was overshadowed by this turmoil. She entered a world not of warmth and celebration, but of icy disapproval and broken affection. In those days, the birth of a princess was meant to be a moment of public pride and private joy, yet Charlotte's arrival brought little happiness to her parents. Her father, already embittered by his failing marriage, saw her as a reminder of his wife's disobedience. Her mother, heartbroken and restless, found herself increasingly alienated from court life. Within a few years, the marriage collapsed entirely. Marianne's decision to live openly apart from her husband and later to pursue her own life, something unthinkable for a royal woman at that time, caused a scandal across Europe. The fallout of that scandal would define Charlotte's childhood. Separated from her mother at a young age, Charlotte grew up in an environment stripped of tenderness. She was left in the care of her father, whose rigid sense of propriety left no room for emotional comfort. He was determined that his daughter should not inherit her mother's rebellious nature and imposed strict discipline upon her. She was taught to suppress her feelings and to obey without question. Her upbringing became a form of emotional imprisonment, one where affection was replaced by duty and silence was mistaken for strength. In her early years, she displayed intelligence and curiosity, qualities that could have flourished under nurturing guidance. Instead, they were often stifled. Her tutors noted her sensitivity, her tendency to overthink, and her quiet sadness. At times, she would retreat from her lessons and prefer solitude. The adults around her dismissed this as childish whimsy, but it was the first sign of the melancholy that would later dominate her life. In a family obsessed with discipline and public image, her introspective nature was seen as a flaw rather than a gift. The Prussian court's atmosphere offered little respite. It was a place of strict etiquette and constant surveillance, where every gesture and word was judged. Charlotte's every move was observed and compared to expectations she could never meet. The whispers about her family's scandal followed her everywhere. Even as a child, she could sense the unspoken tension that hung over her name. Other royal families viewed her with polite curiosity but kept their distance. The sins of her parents became a shadow that trailed her through childhood, a curse she could not escape. It was not only emotional pain that marked her early life. Charlotte's health, fragile from birth, soon became a constant source of worry. She suffered from recurring fevers, headaches, and long periods of fatigue. The physicians of the time, limited in understanding, could offer little more than rest and prayer. Her illnesses often kept her isolated, and in that isolation, her mind grew restless. Loneliness became her closest companion. She wrote later that she often felt invisible, like a figure fading from view in a grand room full of people who pretended not to see her. Her physical weakness and emotional sensitivity fed into the court's belief that she was somehow cursed. The superstitions of the time were strong, even among the educated. The idea of fate and divine punishment played a large role in how people interpreted misfortune. Some whispered that her mother's defiance had brought bad luck upon the family, that Charlotte's frailty was a mark of divine displeasure. To a young girl, growing up surrounded by such whispers, the weight of that supposed curse became unbearable. She began to internalize the idea that she was different, that sorrow was part of her identity. Her adolescence did little to change this perception. As she grew older, her beauty became apparent, but it was accompanied by a distant, almost haunted expression that many found unsettling. She smiled rarely, and when she did, it seemed tinged with sadness. Those who met her described her as gentle and thoughtful, but always somehow apart. The combination of her delicate health, her melancholy temperament, and her family's tainted reputation created an image of a princess marked by fate. The expectations placed upon her as a royal woman only deepened her burden. She was expected to embody grace, obedience, and composure at all times. There was no space for vulnerability in her world. When she struggled, it was treated as weakness. When she showed emotion, it was called hysteria. Her life became a constant performance, an attempt to meet impossible standards. Every failure, however small, was seen not as human but as proof of her supposed curse. Charlotte's relationship with her father remained cold and formal throughout her youth. He saw her more as a duty than as a daughter. He arranged her education carefully, ensuring that she learned languages, etiquette, and religion, but he never offered her affection. The absence of warmth in her home life drove her to seek comfort in writing and reading. Books became her refuge, a world where she could imagine herself free from the strictures of her rank. Yet even in her private thoughts, she could not escape the sense that her destiny was already written. In her teenage years, as marriage prospects began to arise, her position as a princess came to the forefront. Every royal match was a matter of diplomacy, not of love. Suitors were discussed as if they were pieces on a chessboard. Charlotte, shy and hesitant, had little say in these decisions. Her fragile health and emotional instability made her a less desirable candidate in the eyes of many courts, but her lineage still carried value. Eventually, a match was found that suited political needs, not personal happiness. Even before her marriage, Her misfortunes were well known among Europe's nobility. The idea of a cursed princess began to follow her more openly. Newspapers and gossip columns of the time, though far more restrained than modern ones, still carried quiet insinuations about her temperament and her family's misfortunes. Her name became linked not with joy or promise, but with melancholy. She was seen as a symbol of the darker side of royal life, a figure to be pitied rather than admired. Her engagement was treated as a political triumph, but privately it was another chapter of sorrow. She entered marriage not with hope, but with resignation. Her husband, Prince George of Saxe-Meiningen, was known for his discipline and seriousness, traits that mirrored her father's more than she could bear. The early years of their union were marked by formality and emotional distance. Charlotte's health deteriorated further, and the strain of adapting to a new court only deepened her depression. As her troubles became more visible, her royal status transformed her private pain into public spectacle. In a royal household, nothing remained private for long. Servants, courtiers, and visitors all observed her struggles, and soon her ailments became the subject of gossip. The people around her spoke of her in hushed tones, describing her as delicate, nervous, or unwell. Her condition became a kind of entertainment for the curious. Each fainting spell, each retreat into solitude, became proof that the curse of the Prussian princess was real. For Charlotte, this loss of privacy was devastating. Every moment of weakness was magnified, every gesture analyzed. She could not suffer quietly. Even her attempts to recover her strength, long stays in the countryside, periods of rest away from court, were seen as signs of her instability. The crown that should have protected her instead turned her vulnerability into spectacle. Her pain was not her own, it belonged to the public eye. The perception of her curse grew stronger as time went on. The royal family's efforts to conceal her illness only fueled speculation. Newspapers hinted at madness, and letters between other royal households carried whispers of tragedy. Her position, once a symbol of status, became a prison. The very visibility that defined her rank stripped her of the dignity of private suffering. The walls of protocol and public scrutiny closed in around her, leaving her trapped in a life she could not escape. Her story during these years reveals much about how society viewed women of her standing. A royal woman was expected to be flawless, a symbol of the state's strength and virtue. When she failed to meet those ideals, she was treated not with compassion, but with scorn or pity. Charlotte's struggles were never seen as human pain, but as failure to live up to her role. Her body and mind, weakened by illness and despair, were turned into symbols of moral weakness. The tragedy of her early life lies not only in her personal misfortunes, but in how they were amplified by her royal position. If she had been born into an ordinary family, her illnesses might have been treated quietly, her sadness understood as part of her humanity. But as a princess, every aspect of her life was magnified under the relentless gaze of the court. Her pain became part of the narrative of her family's legacy. Her supposed curse, rather than a private sorrow, became a public identity. This constant scrutiny made it impossible for her to heal. Every attempt to withdraw from the spotlight only drew more attention. When she appeared in public, her pale appearance and fragile demeanor were interpreted as proof of her misfortune. When she stayed hidden, people assumed the worst. There was no escape. The more she tried to live quietly, the louder the whispers became. In many ways, Charlotte's early hardships reflected the contradictions of monarchy itself. The same institution that promised power and privilege also imposed suffocating restrictions. Her life illustrates how isolation and emotional repression could destroy even those at the top of society. She was expected to embody perfection while being denied the freedom to be imperfect. Her curse was not a supernatural fate, but the weight of expectations she could never fulfill. As she moved further into adulthood, the consequences of those early years became irreversible. The illnesses that had plagued her childhood deepened into chronic suffering. The emotional wounds inflicted by her upbringing left scars that no treatment could heal. The constant public scrutiny that defined her life left her feeling stripped of identity. She had become, in the eyes of the world, the embodiment of royal tragedy. From the moment of her birth, Charlotte's story was written in shadows. Every joy was undercut by misfortune, every hope by disappointment. Her cursed label, born from gossip and superstition, became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The world saw in her not a woman, but a symbol, a princess doomed by her lineage, her frailty, and her sorrow. Yet beneath that image was a person who longed simply to be understood, to live beyond the whispers that defined her. Her early life stands as a quiet tragedy, a warning of how easily human suffering can be turned into spectacle when wrapped in royal splendor. The crown she wore as a child was not a mark of privilege, but of confinement. The kingdom that should have nurtured her instead watched her struggle, as though she were part of a story meant for their amusement. Her beginning, shaped by conflict, scandal, and relentless scrutiny, was the foundation of the sorrowful life that followed. A kingdom's unkind start that marked her as cursed long before she ever had the chance to change her fate. The course of Princess Charlotte of Prussia's life seemed to move along a path that had been drawn long before she could make her own choices. The world into which she was born had already marked her as different, as someone destined to carry the weight of her family's misfortunes. What had begun as a childhood clouded by parental conflict and emotional deprivation turned into an adulthood shaped by loss, duty, and unending sorrow. The same whispers that had once surrounded her birth grew louder as she grew older, and the legend of the cursed princess began to take firm hold. Her life was not merely touched by misfortune. It was built upon it, molded by forces of family expectation, political maneuvering, and her own fragile spirit. The first major turn in her destiny came with her marriage to George of Saxe-Meiningen. It was not a love story, nor even a partnership built on mutual respect. The match was arranged in the traditional royal manner, meant to strengthen ties between two noble houses. For Charlotte, it represented duty rather than hope. She had little say in the matter, and her consent was given under pressure rather than genuine desire. Her father and his advisors saw the marriage as a means of repairing her family's reputation, tarnished by her mother's defiance and the scandals that had followed. To them, it was a way of restoring honor. To Charlotte, it was the start of another chapter in a life ruled by others. George of Saxe-Meiningen was a man of principle and intellect, respected by his peers but known for his severity. His devotion to military service and his belief in discipline mirrored her father's temperament. Charlotte, on the other hand, longed for understanding and tenderness, qualities she had been denied since childhood. The difference between them became evident almost at once. Where George valued duty, she yearned for affection. Where he sought control, she craved freedom. The court at Meiningen was smaller and less rigid than the Prussian one, but its expectations were no less binding. Charlotte was required to play her part as a dutiful wife and future duchess, appearing in public, hosting gatherings, and upholding the dignity of her position. Her health and spirit, however, were not equal to those demands. Soon after her marriage, her frail condition worsened. She began to suffer more frequent illnesses, marked by exhaustion, fainting spells, and deep melancholy. Doctors of the time, uncertain of what afflicted her, diagnosed her with nervous disorders, a term often used to describe symptoms that were poorly understood. The treatments prescribed, rest, isolation, cold baths, and tonics, did nothing to ease her suffering. Instead, they deepened her sense of imprisonment. Her husband's patience grew thin as he watched her retreat further into herself, unable to fulfill the roles expected of her. To him, her sickness seemed like weakness. To her, his coldness felt like punishment. The birth of her daughter, also named Charlotte, briefly gave her hope. For a moment, it seemed as though she might find purpose and peace in motherhood. But her health deteriorated sharply after childbirth, and her emotional stability collapsed under the strain. She was often too weak to care for her child and spent long periods confined to her rooms. Her inability to recover fully led to more gossip within the court. People whispered that she was unstable, that her family's misfortunes had reappeared in her. The idea of her being cursed once again resurfaced, now with new fuel. Her husband's growing frustration with her condition only increased her isolation. He was a man who believed in the order of things, and his wife's unpredictable behavior and persistent illnesses embarrassed him. Rather than offering support, he withdrew emotionally, leaving her to face her despair alone. The royal household functioned around her as though she were invisible. Servants obeyed her out of duty, but avoided her company. Courtiers spoke about her in cautious tones, treating her as both a figure of pity and an object of rumor. Her life, once again, became a spectacle for others to observe. The pressures of royal duty did not ease with her declining health. She was expected to attend events and maintain appearances, but each outing left her more drained. The strain between her private suffering and public image became unbearable. Letters written during this period reveal her awareness of her situation. She described feeling trapped between two worlds, the one she showed to others and the one she carried inside her. She wrote of sleepless nights filled with thoughts she could not express, of the feeling of being watched constantly, of being judged not for who she was, but for what she represented. Her correspondence with a few trusted relatives and friends shows a woman torn between the expectations of her rank and her longing for a quiet, ordinary life. She often spoke of wanting to escape to the countryside, away from the court, where she might breathe freely. But such freedom was not possible for someone of her position. Her life was bound by the rules of her title. Every movement, every choice, was dictated by custom and politics. She belonged not to herself, but to the royal image she was required to uphold. The political landscape of Europe during this time only added to her distress. The 19th century was a period of immense change. Monarchies were under growing pressure from the rise of liberal movements, and the old order of absolute rule was beginning to fracture. Within the Prussian royal family, tensions grew over how to balance tradition with the new political realities. For someone like Charlotte, already fragile and withdrawn, these shifts created additional anxiety. She found herself caught in the middle of conversations about national duty, dynastic responsibility, and family honor. Topics far removed from the personal comfort she so desperately needed. Her husband, increasingly preoccupied with state matters, became more distant. His attention turned toward military reform and governance, while Charlotte's struggles became secondary concerns. When her behavior grew erratic, alternating between moments of lucidity and periods of deep depression, he consulted doctors who recommended seclusion. The decision to confine her to private quarters was made under the guise of treatment, but it was also an act of containment. The family feared that her instability might damage their reputation. As her condition worsened, she was moved to a private estate, away from public view. Officially, she was there to recover her health, but in reality, it was a quiet exile. Few visitors were allowed, and her contact with her daughter became limited. This isolation marked a turning point in her life. The separation from her child cut her deeply. She wrote repeatedly about her longing to see her guilt for being absent, and her fear that her daughter would grow up without knowing her. These letters are some of the most haunting evidence of her suffering. They show a woman fully aware of her fading place in the world, clinging to what little remained of her identity as a mother and a person. Her family's role in her decline cannot be ignored. Rather than showing compassion, they often treated her illness as an inconvenience. In a time when mental health carried immense stigma, her condition was seen as a source of embarrassment. It was more convenient to hide her away than to confront the truth of her suffering. Even her closest relatives avoided discussing her openly, preferring silence to acknowledgement. That silence became another form of cruelty. To be forgotten while still alive was perhaps the deepest wound she endured. In those years of seclusion, Charlotte's world grew smaller and smaller. The once grand halls of her youth were replaced by quiet rooms and narrow corridors. Her attendants, carefully chosen for discretion, interacted with her only when necessary. The lively conversation and laughter of court life were replaced by the creak of floorboards and the rustle of curtains. She wrote less often, and her handwriting became unsteady. Some of her later notes are almost illegible, filled with fragmented thoughts and half-finished sentences. They reveal a mind caught between awareness and confusion, between lucidity and despair. Contemporaries who heard of her situation often spoke of it as proof of the curse that had followed her since birth. The story of the cursed princess became part of whispered royal lore, repeated in salons and drawing rooms across Europe. Few bothered to see her as a real person anymore. She had become a myth, a symbol of tragedy. Even her death would later be spoken of more as a cautionary tale than as the loss of a woman who had once been alive, hopeful, and human. But if the world saw only a cursed figure, her letters reveal something deeper. A person trapped by circumstance, struggling to hold on to fragments of herself. Her words show moments of clarity and self-awareness, where she reflected on her situation with painful honesty. She questioned the meaning of her life, the purpose of her suffering, and the nature of duty. She wondered whether her fate was the result of divine will or simply human failure. In those reflections, one can see not madness, but profound sensitivity and understanding. Charlotte's life was shaped by decisions that were never her own. From her parents' separation to her arranged marriage, from her confinement to her eventual isolation, every major event in her life was determined by others. Her lack of agency was absolute. The people who made those decisions believed they were acting in the best interests of the family or the crown, but in truth, they stripped her of her humanity. To live constantly under control without the ability to shape one's own destiny, is a form of living death. Charlotte's tragedy lies not only in her illnesses or her solitude, but in this total loss of self. Even within the narrow confines of her existence, she continued to seek meaning. She read extensively, often turning to poetry and philosophy. The books that remained with her show her interest in questions of fate and freedom. Marginal notes in her hand suggest she identified deeply with characters who struggled against circumstances beyond their control. These quiet acts of reflection were her way of holding on to a sense of self when everything else had been taken from her. As her physical condition declined, so too did her sense of time. Days and nights blended together in her solitude. Visitors described her as pale, her hair prematurely streaked with gray, her eyes distant yet alert when she chose to speak. At times, she seemed to drift into silence for hours, staring out of windows or into the fire. On other days, she spoke with surprising clarity about her memories, recalling moments from childhood, her mother's laughter, or the scent of gardens she had once walked through. These flashes of lucidity were brief but poignant, reminders that beneath her illness, she remained aware of who she had been. Her daughter's visits, though rare, were among the few bright moments in her later years. Yet even these encounters were bittersweet. The younger Charlotte grew up under the watchful eyes of relatives who feared her mother's instability might be hereditary. The distance between them was both physical and emotional. Each visit ended in tears, with the younger woman returning to court life and the elder sinking back into her lonely existence. The mother's fear that her child would inherit her misfortune haunted her to the end. By the time of her final decline, Princess Charlotte had become a figure shrouded in silence. Few official records mention her after she was placed under permanent care. The royal family preferred to keep her out of public discussion. When she died, the news was handled discreetly, with little ceremony. There were no grand tributes or elaborate memorials, only quiet acknowledgement. Her passing was treated as the closing of an unfortunate chapter, not the loss of a life full of unfulfilled potential. In the aftermath, her story was remembered mostly through the lens of superstition and pity. The myth of the cursed princess lived on, while the reality of her humanity faded further from view. Yet the evidence of her life, her letters, her recorded words, the recollections of those few who saw her compassionately, tells a different story. It reveals not a woman doomed by fate, but one destroyed by the constraints of her world. Her so-called curse was not the work of unseen forces, but of the society that refused to see her pain as real. The unraveling of Charlotte's destiny was not a single moment of downfall, but a slow erosion. Every decision made without her consent chipped away at her spirit. Every expectation she could not meet deepened her despair. Every whisper of scandal or rumor of madness isolated her further. The tragedy of her life lies in how easily a sensitive and intelligent woman was reduced to a symbol of weakness. Her suffering was not inevitable. It was created, piece by piece, by the cold machinery of royal life. Charlotte's story stands as both a personal and a universal tale. It is the story of a woman born into privilege but denied freedom, surrounded by people yet profoundly alone. Her life was defined by others' choices, her voice drowned out by the demands of duty and decorum. She was called cursed because it was easier for others to believe in fate than to confront their own cruelty. Yet her words, her small acts of reflection, and her enduring humanity show that even in silence, she resisted being entirely erased. The path of her life, from her troubled childhood to her loveless marriage, from her isolation to her quiet death, was one long unraveling of destiny. It was the story of how a princess became a prisoner within her own life, and how the myth of her curse became a shield for those who failed her. Beneath the layers of tragedy and legend lies a truth both painful and profound. Charlotte of Prussia was not cursed by fate, but by the world that refused to see her as anything more than a symbol of sorrow. The memory of Princess Charlotte of Prussia faded quietly into the margins of history, buried beneath the weight of her family's more celebrated names and the passing indifference of time. Though her life was marked by tragedy, scandal, and the kind of emotional depth that should have made her a figure of fascination, she became a ghost in the chronicles of European royalty. Her story was not forgotten by accident. It was erased through silence, overshadowed by the dominant narratives of her era. The same forces that shaped her sorrowful life, politics, family pride, and rigid societal roles, also determined how she would be remembered. In the grand sweep of European history, her name dissolved like ink in water, leaving behind only faint traces of the woman she once was. When Charlotte died, there was no public mourning beyond the formal courtesies of a royal notice. The world moved on swiftly, and within a generation, her story had already been reduced to fragments. Historians, eager to celebrate the achievements of kings, emperors, and generals, found little reason to dwell on a princess whose life had been defined by illness and isolation. Her letters, where she had bared her soul in fragile handwriting, were left unread or destroyed. Official records referred to her in passing, noting her lineage and marriage, but omitting the pain that had consumed her. In a century fascinated by progress and heroism, there was little space for the tale of a woman who had neither triumphed nor defied her circumstances. Charlotte's life did not fit the mold of what history valued. The chroniclers of her time, mostly men serving royal or political purposes, preferred stories of conquest, diplomacy, and public deeds. The private suffering of women, no matter how poignant, was treated as incidental, something unworthy of serious attention. Royal women were remembered if they were beautiful, scandalous, or influential in shaping political alliances. Those who lived quietly, or whose lives ended in obscurity, were often omitted. Charlotte belonged to the latter group. Her tragedy was not one of rebellion or public disgrace, but of slow erasure, a life undone not by scandal but by silence. There was also an unspoken discomfort in remembering her story. Royal families of the 19th century were deeply concerned with appearances. The image of stability and virtue mattered more than truth. To acknowledge Charlotte's decline into illness and despair would have meant admitting the cruelty and neglect within the system that claimed to protect its own. It would have drawn attention to the emotional cost of maintaining royal dignity at all costs. It was easier, then, to let her name fade. Her suffering did not serve the narrative of strength and continuity that monarchies relied upon to justify their existence. Even within her own family, Charlotte's memory was treated with caution. Her father's descendants preferred to emphasize the achievements of those who upheld the Prussian ideal of discipline and success. Her mother, who had lived independently and faced her own controversies, was remembered with a mixture of fascination and reproach. Between those two figures, Charlotte became almost invisible. Her daughter, though she carried her name, grew up to live a more conventional royal life, careful to avoid her mother's reputation for fragility. The family archives that survived mention Charlotte only in formal terms, dates of birth and marriage, brief notes on her illness, and a record of her death. The human being behind those details was lost to time. The gendered nature of historical writing played a central role in this disappearance. The history of royalty was, for centuries, written by men who viewed women's experiences through a narrow lens. A princess's value lay in her beauty, her marriage, or her ability to bear heirs. Her emotions, struggles, and inner life were rarely considered worthy of record. If she fell ill, her condition was described in vague medical terms. If she suffered mentally, it was dismissed as weakness or hysteria. For a woman like Charlotte, whose existence defied the ideal of the composed, dutiful royal lady, there was little sympathy and even less curiosity. Her suffering was not seen as tragedy, but as failure. In contrast, male members of her family who faced personal struggles were remembered with nuance and empathy. Their flaws were framed as signs of complexity or humanity, their decisions analyzed in the context of leadership and responsibility. Charlotte's pain, by comparison, was treated as an inconvenience. It did not fit the masculine narrative of royal endurance and triumph. The imbalance was not unique to her story. It reflected a broader pattern in which women's experiences were filtered through the values of a world that prized control over compassion. This erasure was compounded by the notion of success that governed royal memory. To be remembered, one had to achieve something visible, to lead armies, to shape nations, to marry advantageously, or at least to embody beauty and grace in the public eye. Charlotte achieved none of these things. She was not a queen, a political figure, or a cultural icon. Her health prevented her from performing the public roles expected of her. Her marriage did not produce a dynasty of note. Her name did not adorn monuments or palaces. In the eyes of history, she was an unsuccessful royal, and the unsuccessful are rarely celebrated. The idea of a cursed princess, while dramatic, became a convenient label for explaining her life without engaging with its painful truths. To call her cursed was to turn her suffering into something fated, a story of inevitability rather than responsibility. It excused those who had failed her and absolved society of its neglect. The The myth of the curse made her tragedy easier to tell, but it also stripped her of agency. She became a symbol of misfortune rather than a woman with thoughts, choices, and emotions. By reducing her life to superstition, history transformed her into a ghost rather than a person. The few writers who mentioned her after her death often did so with pity rather than understanding. They described her as delicate, sensitive, and unfortunate, adjectives that sounded sympathetic but were laced with dismissal. Her intellect, her insight, and her quiet strength in enduring years of isolation went unrecognized. The idea that a royal woman could be both vulnerable and intelligent, both suffering and self-aware, was foreign to a world that preferred simple categories. Charlotte did not fit any of them neatly, and so she was forgotten. The silence surrounding her life reflects not only the biases of her time, but also the deeper discomfort of confronting what she represented. She embodied the emotional consequences of a system built on hierarchy and control. Her despair was not just personal. It was the product of a world that valued appearances over empathy, duty over humanity. To remember her honestly would have required acknowledging that the grandeur of royalty often hid great cruelty. For those invested in preserving the myth of royal virtue, it was easier to let her memory slip away. The historians of later generations, when they began to revisit the private lives of royals, found little material to work with. The destruction or suppression of her personal correspondence ensured that only fragments of her voice survived. The few documents that did remain painted an incomplete picture. Without context, she appeared as a tragic footnote, a woman undone by melancholy. It was only much later, as scholars began to question traditional narratives, that her life started to attract renewed attention. Yet even then, she was treated more as a curiosity than as a subject of genuine study. The veil of obscurity that covered Charlotte's story reveals how history itself can become a form of injustice. The selective nature of remembrance shapes not only how we understand the past, but whose lives we consider worthy of telling. Charlotte's exclusion was not simply an accident of time, it was the outcome of a deliberate pattern, one that favored power, visibility, and success over quiet endurance. Her tragedy lacked spectacle, her suffering offered no political lesson, and her voice was too subdued to echo through the centuries. And so she was silenced once more, this time not by her family, but by history itself. In the rare moments when her name does appear in historical works, it is often alongside phrases like unfortunate princess or a tale of sorrow. Such descriptions reduce her to a single emotion, stripping away the complexity of her existence. She becomes not a person but a symbol, the embodiment of fragility, failure, and sadness. Yet the truth is far richer. Her life, when viewed through the fragments that remain, tells a story of resilience as much as of despair. To endure years of illness and loneliness without entirely losing her sense of self required a quiet strength that deserves recognition. Her obscurity also reflects a broader truth about the way society remembers women who do not fit its ideals. History has long celebrated women who conform to certain images: the devoted mother, the dazzling beauty, the political schemer, or the martyr. Charlotte was none of these. She did not manipulate power, she did not charm her way into fame, and she did not die dramatically. Her suffering was slow, private, and deeply human. In a world that values spectacle, such a life leaves few marks. It is striking that her story, though once whispered about as an example of misfortune, disappeared almost entirely from public consciousness. The gossip that had surrounded her during her lifetime turned into indifference after her death. The court that had once watched her every move forgot her name. Even the people of Meiningen, whose duchy she had married into, left little record of her presence. Her portrait, painted during her early years, hung in silence in a remote gallery, unvisited and unremarked upon. It was as though she had never existed. Her disappearance from history also reflects the uncomfortable truth that society tends to erase those whose lives end without redemption. Had Charlotte's suffering led to a dramatic recovery, or had she transformed her pain into art, politics, or influence, she might have been remembered differently. But she died quietly, without resolution, her life a series of unanswered questions. History prefers stories that end with triumph or transformation. Charlotte offered neither, and so she was quietly set aside. Yet her absence from the historical record speaks volumes about the nature of remembrance itself. It exposes the fragility of legacy, the way that power and importance are often measured by visibility rather than value. Her obscurity is not a sign of insignificance, but of the narrowness of the stories that were chosen to be told. Behind every forgotten figure like Charlotte lies a world of emotion, struggle, and meaning that the official chronicles overlook. To remember her now is not merely to fill a gap, but to challenge the assumptions that created it. In understanding why she was forgotten, one also begins to see how history favors the winners, the visible, and the victorious. The unsuccessful royal, the one who failed to marry well, to rule, or to inspire legend, becomes an embarrassment to the institutions that shaped her. Charlotte represented everything monarchy wished to conceal: vulnerability, illness, and unhappiness within its own walls. Her silence was useful. It allowed the myth of royal perfection to endure. By erasing her, the royal family preserved the illusion that all within their ranks lived lives of purpose and control. Her story, though buried, remains a powerful reflection of how easily a person's reality can be transformed into myth or forgotten altogether. The image of the cursed princess persisted long after the woman herself was gone, serving as a convenient symbol of misfortune rather than a reminder of injustice. That distortion, repeated over time, became her legacy. The real Charlotte, the thoughtful, sensitive, and wounded human being, was lost beneath layers of misunderstanding. The tragedy of her obscurity lies not only in what was forgotten, but in what was never known. The silence that surrounded her life ensured that her inner world, her reflections, and her fleeting moments of peace were never shared. The stories that could have revealed her humanity were either destroyed or left untold. What remains is a faint outline, enough to hint at her depth, but not enough to fully capture it. She exists now as an echo, a reminder of all the voices history has chosen not to hear. If her story has resurfaced in fragments, it is only because modern historians and readers have begun to look differently at the past. Where earlier generations sought heroes, today there is greater interest in the hidden, the voiceless, and the forgotten. Charlotte's life, once dismissed as insignificant, now stands as a mirror reflecting the silent suffering that accompanied the grandeur of royal life. Her obscurity, rather than diminishing her, gives her story a quiet strength. It forces us to question what we value in remembrance and whose pain we choose to acknowledge. Princess Charlotte of Prussia lived and died under the shadow of forces she could not control. In life, she was silenced by expectation and confinement. In death, she was silenced by history's indifference. Yet through the faint traces she left behind, her story continues to whisper. It speaks not of curses or failure, but of endurance. The endurance of a woman who bore the weight of sorrow in a world that refused to see her pain. Her disappearance from the pages of history is not the end of her story, but its most haunting chapter, reminding us that even in obscurity, truth endures, waiting for someone to listen once more. Charlotte of Prussia's story does not end in the silence that history imposed upon her. Her life, though wrapped in tragedy and long neglected, holds meaning that stretches far beyond her own time. The forgotten princess, once dismissed as cursed, stands today as a reflection of the deeper truths about society, truths that remain relevant even in the modern world. Her suffering, often described as misfortune, was in fact the result of systems that confined her, expectations that crushed individuality, and a culture that preferred appearances to authenticity. What was once called a curse was not a supernatural fate, but the consequence of human indifference, the weight of tradition, and the rigid structure of power that left little room for compassion. When we look at her story now, from the distance of centuries, it becomes a mirror through which we can examine our own collective failures. Charlotte's pain speaks not only of a royal life gone awry, but of a pattern that persists. The silencing of those who do not fit within accepted narratives, the marginalization of those whose struggles disturb our ideals of success and beauty. In her world, weakness was forbidden, and to suffer was seen as a moral flaw. Today, despite all progress, echoes of that thinking still exist. We still measure worth by productivity, still prize the polished over the honest, and still hesitate to acknowledge emotional suffering when it challenges our comfort. Charlotte's story, stripped of its royal setting, is the story of anyone crushed beneath invisible expectations. Her so-called curse was the inability to live freely in a world that valued image over reality. It was the curse of being born into privilege but denied agency, of being seen as an ornament rather than a person. That experience, while belonging to the 19th century, remains familiar to many in different forms. The burden of roles, the pressure to appear perfect, the fear of being forgotten. These are not relics of her time. They are conditions that persist, reshaped by modernity but unchanged in essence. In that sense, her life is not just a relic of royal sorrow, but a timeless reminder of the cost of silence and conformity. If we listen closely, Charlotte's haunting echo invites us to question how we, too, handle those who struggle. Her illness, described vaguely by contemporaries as melancholy or frailty, was a symptom of deeper emotional neglect. She was surrounded by people yet profoundly alone, watched but never seen. Even today, many experience similar isolation despite living in an age of constant connection. Her life teaches us that visibility does not equal understanding, and that recognition without empathy is hollow. The same society that admired her beauty in youth turned away from her suffering when it became uncomfortable to witness. The same pattern repeats in modern forms whenever society turns its gaze from those in pain because their truth disturbs the illusion of harmony. There is also a broader lesson about how history itself operates. The erasure of Charlotte from public memory was not accidental. It was a decision shaped by what society chose to value. The stories of women, especially those who did not conform to the expected image of grace or triumph, were deemed unworthy of record. Their emotions, their quiet endurance, their failures, all of these were dismissed as irrelevant. By recovering Charlotte's story, we confront that bias. We recognize that history is not only the record of victories, but also the reflection of losses, of forgotten voices that reveal the limits of the world that silenced them. To remember her is to insist that suffering has meaning and that every life, however overshadowed, contributes to our shared understanding of humanity. Reframing her curse means understanding it as a product of her environment, not a mystical destiny. She was not born doomed. She was made to feel doomed by a culture that did not allow vulnerability. The idea of a cursed princess is seductive because it turns tragedy into spectacle, but it hides the truth that she was a casualty of societal cruelty. In giving her story back its context, we transform pity into awareness. Her pain becomes a warning, not a myth. It shows us what happens when systems value obedience over empathy, and when individuals are judged by how well they perform their assigned roles rather than by who they are. This reframing also helps us see that her curse was not only personal but collective. It reflected the sickness of a world that equated worth with perfection. It is the same sickness that still whispers through modern life, in the pressure to present happiness, to conceal weakness, to strive endlessly for validation. Charlotte's struggle, once confined to palace walls, is now mirrored in digital spaces, in the silent competition for admiration and the quiet despair behind curated appearances. Her story reminds us that progress in technology or status does not always mean progress in empathy. Unless we learn to listen to those who suffer quietly, we risk repeating the same neglect that destroyed her spirit. Charlotte's haunting legacy also speaks to the responsibility of memory. Every forgotten story represents a failure to see the full picture of our shared past. When history silences someone like her, it robs us of understanding not just who she was, but what her experience reveals about the world around her. Remembering her is not an act of sentimentality, but one of justice. It restores balance by acknowledging that pain, too, has a place in history, and that even the smallest, quietest lives can illuminate great truths about human nature. Unearthing her story also helps us reconsider how we treat other sidelined figures, those dismissed as unimportant, unsuccessful, or cursed by circumstance. Each forgotten life holds lessons about resilience, injustice, and survival. By bringing them back into the light, we enrich our understanding of history and of ourselves. Charlotte's story, fragile as it may seem, becomes part of a larger movement to reclaim the voices that history buried, the women, the outsiders, the misunderstood. Their stories challenge the narrow definitions of success that have shaped our collective memory. It is easy to romanticize her suffering, to imagine her as a tragic figure trapped in a melancholy painting. But doing so would repeat the same mistake her contemporaries made. The goal is not to glorify her pain, but to humanize it. She deserves to be seen not as a symbol, but as a person, intelligent, emotional, and wounded by forces beyond her control. When we strip away the royal titles and the myths, we see a woman whose struggles were deeply human. Her longing for understanding, her isolation, her yearning for peace. These emotions transcend time and class. In that way, her echo reaches us not as a relic but as a companion, reminding us that empathy is the only antidote to erasure. The act of telling her story is itself a form of restoration. Each word written about her pushes back against the silence that once surrounded her. It is an acknowledgement that even those who were denied agency in life deserve recognition in memory. Her voice, faint but enduring, becomes part of a larger chorus of forgotten figures calling to be heard. The process of listening to them reshapes how we see the past. It shifts the focus from power to vulnerability, from achievement to endurance, from spectacle to sincerity. Her life also challenges the idea that tragedy is meaningless. There is dignity in her endurance, even if the world failed to see it. She continued to exist within her confined world, finding small moments of reflection and courage. That quiet perseverance, though overlooked, is perhaps her greatest legacy. It teaches that survival, even in sorrow, holds value. Her story reminds us that strength is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it resides in the simple act of enduring what cannot be changed. Today, as we grapple with our own systems of inequality, Charlotte's life becomes a mirror to examine how society still shapes and silences individuals. Whether in politics, workplaces, or personal relationships, the same dynamics persist. Those with less power are often unheard, their pain minimized or ignored. Charlotte's isolation reflects the cost of that imbalance. Remembering her urges us to confront the structures that allow such silence to persist. Her supposed curse becomes a metaphor for all the unseen burdens carried by those who are expected to endure quietly. There is also a lesson about compassion in how we view those who fall outside conventional success. Charlotte's life, measured by royal standards, was a failure. She did not command, inspire, or achieve greatness. But when we look beyond those measures, we see a woman whose existence exposed the flaws in the very system that judged her. She revealed, by her suffering, that the royal ideal of perfection was hollow. Her inability to thrive within that framework was not her weakness, but proof of its cruelty. In that sense, she became a silent critic of the world that confined her. Her story, therefore, is not just about personal tragedy, but about the courage to be human in a place that punished humanity. Each forgotten life like hers invites us to rethink what stories deserve to be remembered. The rediscovery of such voices changes how we understand history. It teaches that power and influence are not the only measures of significance. Empathy and endurance matter just as much. The haunting quality of Charlotte's memory lies in its incompleteness. We cannot fully reconstruct her thoughts or emotions, but we can imagine them through the traces she left. That act of imagination is not merely historical but moral. It demands that we approach the past with humility and compassion, recognizing that for every celebrated figure there are countless others whose stories were never told. To honor Charlotte is to honor them all, to acknowledge that history is richer and more truthful when it includes those who were once silenced. In remembering her, we also take on a responsibility. The same way her voice was lost, countless others continue to be ignored today. Artists, writers, and thinkers whose lives ended before recognition. Individuals oppressed by systems that erase them. Communities whose histories remain untold. All of them exist in the same shadow where Charlotte once stood. To tell her story is to open space for theirs. The act of remembrance becomes an act of defiance against forgetting. We must ask why some lives are considered worthy of remembrance while others are not. Who decides which stories become history, and which fade into myth or obscurity? Charlotte's disappearance exposes how easily truth can be shaped by those in power. The stories that survive are those that serve the dominant narrative. But if we seek a fuller, more honest understanding of the past, we must look beyond the familiar heroes and heroines to the silenced, the marginalized, and the forgotten. Only then can we see the past as it truly was: complex, flawed, and human. Charlotte's echo lingers not only as a reminder of her suffering, but as a call to empathy. It asks us to listen to the quiet voices around us, to notice the lives that go unseen, to understand that every forgotten person carries a story worth telling. Her tragedy becomes a lesson in awareness, that the measure of a society lies not in how it celebrates its powerful, but in how it remembers its forgotten. For those who hear her echo, there is also an invitation. The rediscovery of Charlotte of Prussia is not an ending, but a beginning. It encourages others to look for the lost figures in their own histories. The overlooked women, the silenced thinkers, the artists who never found recognition, the dreamers whose voices were drowned by circumstance. Each of them, like Charlotte, holds a fragment of truth about who we are and how we have come to be. By sharing their stories, we continue the work of repairing the record of the past. The effort to unearth such lives is not merely academic. It is an act of empathy and justice. Every rediscovered story restores a piece of the collective human experience. It expands the boundaries of history beyond power and fame to include vulnerability and struggle. Charlotte's life reminds us that even those who lived unseen can influence how we understand compassion, resilience, and humanity. Her haunting echo will remain as long as we continue to listen. It calls us to remember that behind every forgotten name lies a world of meaning. The rediscovery of Princess Charlotte of Prussia is not only about reclaiming one woman's place in history, but about challenging the silence that still surrounds so many others. Her life, once dismissed as cursed, becomes a symbol of endurance, proof that even in obscurity, truth can persist.